Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a Alberta voice, an energy voice, to speak to us today. Heather Exner-Pirot, who is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She's a very articulate and eloquent speaker about the importance of energy, oil and gas. She comes from Alberta, and she wrote a really interesting piece this week where she actually disagreed, I think, with what Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, was doing and saying. Heather, how are you?
I'm doing good. Yeah, interesting times.
Welcome to the show. So give everyone a little backdrop, if you could, to what has happened and what your position is on the oil and gas / Alberta position and what it should be.
Yeah, well, Trump has come out obviously with an enormous threat to the Canadian economy, to the Canadian people, 25% tariff. I still am on the side that thinks, a full 25% tariff is unlikely. The betting markets think it's still unlikely, that there'll probably be some tariffs on some things. I don't think across the board. But anyways, obviously this is not a great time for the country to be in a crisis. So we don't have very good leadership. We're going to have an election very soon. But the premiers and the prime minister did manage to come together last week for, kind of a Team Canada United Front. Let's deal with the United States as adequately as we can. And, 12 premiers signed on and one premier did not. And that was Danielle Smith. Now, to give her the benefit of the doubt, why she said she didn't sign on is that, she doesn't think that we should be able to use Alberta's oil and gas as the major hammer against the Trump tariffs. And I think there is some gall of saying you've been blocking us for 10 years and, Northern Gateway and Keystone XL and Energy East, yada, yada. And now you want to use our oil and gas as a leverage to protect the Canadian economy. From my perspective, where I disagreed is that, I don't think there should be. I agree with her on the policy. We shouldn't use oil and gas for retaliatory tariffs. I don't think we will have to, because I don't think we'll put tariffs on oil and gas in the first place. But I don't know why you would take those off the table. So I am on the Team Canada side to say, let's have everything on the table. Let's be as crazy as they are. Let's have some good cop, bad cop, and be able to say, wow, if you guys mess with us, we have the ability to mess with you. So my real issue is, why would you take your biggest card, your ace up your sleeve, which is oil and gas? We send them 4.4 million barrels a day. Why would you take it off the table at this point? Even if behind closed doors you said, I don't want any special tariffs on oil and gas. But it seemed like not being a team player this week, I have to say.
So Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, said you got to fight for your jurisdiction, but you got to be Canada and Canadian first. Do you agree with his position?
I agree with his position. And, Alberta has had a rocky relationship with Ottawa these past 9 years for sure. And I sympathize with pretty much in every single way with that. But we are at the end of the day Canadians. And I have to say there have been polls. Do Albertans want to separate? No, only about 20% want to separate. Do they want to join the United States? No, only about 18% want to join the United States. It isn't
yet on both of those higher than anywhere else in Canada.
Still, but not high. I mean, if you're a politician and you have 18% support for something, that's not support for something. So Alberta may be higher. We've had our issues and I sympathize with those. But this to me is the moment for Team Canada. And I'll say why I disagree on the strategy even. One is, I think you're taking off our biggest lever off the table dealing with Trump. And if you want to say that we're an energy superpower, which I do, I want to say it and I say it every day. This is not the week to not be an energy superpower. This is the week to use it to your full force. And I'll say this again, the United States imported record amounts of Canadian oil last week, and no country in the world has ever imported more oil than the United States imported from Canada last week. This is a huge hammer. This is not the week to take that hammer off. But and I've said this before, there's two sides. There's dealing with Trump, and then there's the domestic strategy, which Alberta is still part of this country and still wants to build pipelines. And I feel like if she had been magnanimous? But anyways, if we had done the thing, if we had said, okay, we'll set it aside, we have legitimate grievances. You guys have not been kind to us in Ottawa. But this week, we're going to stand up, we're going to be part of the team, and we're going to do what's right. And we're going to show you why having oil and having this country have pipelines is a good thing for everybody. And I feel like we were so close a week ago to getting, a critical mass, to getting a large number of Canadians agree. Well, we should have had pipelines, we should have had Energy East, we should have had Northern Gateway. We would not be in this position if we had. And I feel like we could have used that goodwill with the Poilievre government, with building the pipelines that we do want to build. And I feel like that goodwill was wasted in favor of nurturing some grievances.
Seems like she's almost spending more time competing politically, position herself against Canada and the federal government than she is against Donald Trump.
It has. I think objectively that's true. And, and I try to explain it is that, and it's been a popular line in the Calgary circuit these last few years that the greatest threat isn't coming from DC, it's coming from Ottawa, to our economy. And I think that was true until about a month ago. And, it certainly rankled me the way that Trump has been talking about Canada. He did not treat Danielle Smith with any particular favor when she went to Mar-a-Lago, said, no, everything is still on the table. She came back saying that. And it was, again, and people in Ontario might not know this, we might have seen the Stephen Harper clip, which I think resonated with a lot of Canadians, resonated with me, to say it doesn't feel like the United States is treating us like a friend or a partner or an ally, and that some of the things Trump has said have been shocking. And Jason Kenney also came out and said, with being very careful and not crossing Smith explicitly, said that if he were in that position, he would be taking a Team Canada route, and he doesn't think we should be taking cards off the table. So I feel in one sense that, Smith and the UCP had a strategy, to exempt Canadian energy from tariffs from a year ago, and it was a great strategy. They've been pretty successful. She's gone on Fox News, she's gone to Mar-a-Lago. That I think maybe when the shift occurred in public opinion vis-a-vis Trump, they were too far into their strategy or didn't see outside their strategy that they couldn't adapt. That's what I think, is that they were just full bore, protect our oil and gas industry. And I think the mood shifted a little bit under their feet, but their strategy didn't.
Now, I don't know if you get involved in partisan politics. My sense is you don't.
I don't.
Pardon?
Otherwise, if I did, I wouldn't be saying all these things against the conservative.
But yet you've been a very strong advocate for the oil and gas business and energy in Canada, and particularly in Western Canada and Alberta. You write about this on a very frequent basis. You've been a big supporter of pipelines. You've been a big supporter of what I would say are more business-friendly economies. Why are you taking this position, and where do you think Alberta people are? Are they on your side or on Danielle Smith's side?
We'll see how big a deal this turns out. A lot will be revealed in the next week, and this will be part of at some point, this will be part of an old business cycle, an old news cycle. But I think my position is very consistent that if you want to expand Alberta oil and gas production, then you do need Canada to be on side. That is a fact. We are in this jurisdiction. Interprovincial pipelines are regulated by Ottawa. They need to be popular in BC. These are all facts. So for me, I think you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. I think the case for pipelines and oil has been shown in spades this week, and that was an opportunity to capitalize on. And now it's turned into a unity question, and those, bad, nasty Albertans being selfish versus good Canada team players. And that is not a conversation that helps what I would want, which is to expand Canadian energy production, which I think is probably a more popular position in the last month than it has been in 10 years. I think my position is proving more and more right. And yet the strategy, is proving more and more difficult.
Pirot's retort was, we just put billions of dollars into building a pipeline to the BC coast. We bought the pipeline from the private sector, and we're, commissioning this massive LNG facility. Is that a fair retort or not?
You will have a hard time getting me to say anything kind about Trudeau at the end of the day. That overall, it's been incredibly destructive and has laid some seeds. I say planted some seeds for this division right now. But no, I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair at all. That it is good. I have to give credit that they did save TMX, that without them it would not have gone through. But it's also because of them that they had to save TMX and the federal government had to invest it. So if we did just have public support for building energy infrastructure, TMX would have been built at a third of the cost. And people have called, and I have to say this, people have called TMX a subsidy for the oil and gas industry, and people listed, environmental NGOs listed as a subsidy. The fact that it's triple the cost that it would have been under a private, proponent project means that oil and gas producers have to pay far higher in tolls to use the pipeline to pay for the costs. And the Canadian Energy Regulator determines the cost based on the government of Canada has to get a return on the $34 billion it spent, the cost of interest and maintenance. And so this is not a project that you go to investors and say, look what Canada can do. We can build TMX. This is a red flag to say, wow, it is really hard to build in Canada. Costs, go grossly over. And not a lot of people want to have mega projects in Canada anymore. And that's for sure, not just in oil and gas. So, and LNG Canada, I don't know how anyone can, credit the Trudeau government for that. I will say how interesting it is to me that as Justin Trudeau resigns and people look at his legacy, they point to TMX and LNG Canada as pros, as things that he's achieved. And if you like TMX and LNG Canada, let me tell you about Northern Gateway and Sealison's LNG. We got a lot more where that can come from. Glad we all agree that pipelines and LNG terminals are good now.
Well, maybe we should turn to that, because I think you're right that now you may have more public support for something like that than you've ever had in the past. And that may be an opportunity to use honey rather than vinegar to get the rest of Canada on board. Let's take a break, however, for some messages, and then come back in just 2 minutes with Heather Exner-Pirot to talk more about energy, Alberta, tariffs, Trump, Daniel Smith, etc. Because it's going to be an interesting situation. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Heather Exner-Pirot. She's with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She's an expert on energy, Western Canada. She's in Alberta, born in Saskatchewan, correct? And grew up in Saskatchewan.
Correct. Yeah, Scott was on Team Canada this week. I had to fit that in.
And on Team Canada this week. Let's take a step back then, if you could, Heather, and tell everyone about sort of where we are on, or could be on pipelines, because, I've read lots of different things of late. One person said that thank God that the Keystone Pipeline didn't go ahead, because frankly, we'd be then more dependent on American purchases of our oil and gas. Other people have said, pipelines going east don't make any sense. Europe is not growing its energy consumption and getting it adequately from other sources in the world. And the right thing is to take it to the BC coast and send it to Asia. Where do you think we are from a pipeline construction approval standpoint? What should we be doing? And also from a refinery, et cetera. In fact, I heard comments like, I had an economist on saying that, we're shipping oil and gas to the United States to get refined, and then it's selling it back to Canada. And that what we should be doing is telling everyone to build more refineries in Canada. So we're not doing what we should be doing. So tell me where you think sort of the long-term benefits for Canada and our oil and gas business are.
Yeah, great question. And I will maintain, and again, why I'm an advocate for oil and gas is because I think it's very important that a country like Canada, with our values, is a major provider of oil and gas in the world. And the most of our competitors are authoritarian states. And as we can see this week, energy can be politicized. Europe has been living this, but many, many countries have been living a politicized energy situation. And I think the more that Canada can provide some redundancy, some optionality, is good for the world. Now, that being said, where should we go next? And again, we just have, we don't have reserves in the years or the decades. We have over a century's worth of oil reserves, of natural gas reserves. And we can certainly, afford to export more, and lots of people want that. Where I would go is certainly Asia. So, discussion now on Keystone XL, again, I would have the same, reaction is, let's not double down on the United States at this point. If they wanted to build it and pay for it, our producers would certainly be happy to fill it. But I wouldn't, as part of, a government strategy or the national interest or the Albertan interest, support using taxpayer dollars or programs or initiatives or anything like that. Where I would absolutely do is Northern Gateway, is the oil pipeline, and Prince Rupert gas transmission would be another gas pipeline. And and one of the reasons, to your point, is where is the market growing is in Asia. And we know that it's already 4.5 billion people. And about 1 billion Asians will enter the middle class this decade. And meaningfully, what happens when you go from being a poor person to a middle class person is you consume more energy. That's, in practical terms, that's what it means. Your material well-being is better off. And so there's no one that doesn't expect meaningful Asian growth to occur in the next couple of decades. And even if China plateaus, and we'll see if it does, even if China plateaus, again, there's 3.5 billion other people in Asia that will be increasing their energy demands, and India has proven that out. So the pace of that, we'll see. But I always say, there's 8 billion people in the world. Maybe it's plateaued in Europe. Maybe it's roughly plateaued-ish in the United States. Maybe roughly plateaued-ish in China. There's 6 billion other people that are not as wealthy as we are and are going to be looking to increase their energy consumption. And even on Europe, I have to say, it's been disastrous for Europe to deindustrialize, to have high energy costs. This is the election issue across Europe. Germany, the likely next chancellor said just this week that, the current coalition has privileged climate objectives over all else, and they will privilege economic objectives. And you have to think that that means that they'll also use a bit more energy than maybe, the 2030, 2040 goals that they had before. So the world runs on energy. I think as long as Canada provides it, we can displace Russian sources, we can displace other authoritarian sources. The United States also putting sanctions on Venezuela, Iran. There will be demand for Canadian oil and gas.
Okay, so if you were Danielle Smith, or if you were negotiating on behalf of the Albertan oil and gas, what would you be asking for? Tell us about this pipeline, this Northern Gateway pipeline. What's its status? What should happen in your mind?
Great question. So this was an Enbridge pipeline that they proposed, did extensive preparations for. We're in advanced stages. They did have some opposition from some Indigenous groups. Other Indigenous groups were very much in favor. This was going to be the first big Indigenous equity pipeline. So there was division, I guess, amongst Indigenous groups, but it wasn't unanimously, for sure, Indigenous groups against. Anyways, Enbridge was about $1 billion into this project when Trudeau canceled it. And it was a little bit of, we'll give you TMX, but we'll cancel Northern Gateway, which doesn't help Enbridge because they weren't advancing TMX. And that was a really critical moment in Canadian energy politics, where every investor looked at Canada and said, no thanks. And it became very difficult to attract anyone's money into any oil and gas projects, because the risk that you could spend $1 billion and then be told no after all that, after the very advanced stage that was in, very problematic. And same with Keystone XL. So now, maybe 2 months ago, we were saying maybe we should do Keystone XL again. TC Energy, now South Bow is their spinoff of their oil side, had no interest in reviving that project. Again, proponents are not interested in the risk that comes with building a pipeline in Canada. So what do you do if you're Alberta? And this is where I'm very much, aligned with the goals of Danielle Smith, is where you do want to increase production, but you need that egress. You need that pipeline capacity. There's a great strategy. And one is that Alberta, and they talked about it in a press with Enbridge a week ago, has an Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission. And it allows them to purchase barrels in lieu of royalties. You get quite a few royalties off companies. I don't think, they don't care too much if they pay you in barrels or in cash. And Alberta could take much of its royalties in barrels and use that purchasing power to purchase or guarantee contract out space on a new pipeline. So to say that we will be your anchor tenant to a new pipeline proponent and say Alberta will use its barrels that it can take in lieu of royalties. And this helps any proponent with investors to say, you know what, I've already got 300,000 barrels filled in this space, so those kind of minimum constraints are gone. And then top that off, not only will you fill the pipeline with barrels at no cost to the taxpayer, it's not equity, it's just contracting out space. On top of that, have an Indigenous loan guarantee. And again, this is where conservative government will come in handy, is use a couple $1 billion from the new federal Indigenous loan guarantee program, use a couple $1 billion from the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, maybe BC would come on side, they have an Indigenous loan guarantee program. Now you've got a few $1 billion in your capital stack, makes all the rest of the investment less risky. You're a realtor guy, you kind of know how capital stacks work more than me. And also you've got a couple $1 billion to earn that Indigenous consent, to say to all those Indigenous communities along the route, you will be owners of this, you will be consulted, you will make good money, this will be very advantageous for you. And so those are, I think, the seeds being planted to get around the fact that Canada is not seen as a jurisdiction that is friendly for investment, to de-risk it without really spending too much taxpayer dollars.
And so this is what, redoing the Northern Gateway?
I mean, that's an obvious one because some of the legwork has been done.
And where does the Norway, remind everyone where it goes from and to?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I'm going to say Hardisty. So I think some of the oil sands, oil goes to around Edmonton and then go west from Edmonton. But I have to say, I don't really know. Somewhere in Alberta, either Edmonton or the oil sands or Cold Lake or in between, and then west. But if it ends at is it Prince Rupert, I think. Anyway, so with the northwest coast of BC, which is much better. TMX ends in Vancouver, and the government, another thing they did, to throw, wrench in our plans, was create an oil tanker moratorium. After they canceled Northern Gateway, they also said no oil tankers can come to the entire BC northwest coast to prevent anyone from reviving Northern Gateway. And so you would have to rescind that. I think there's support to rescind that. But Northwest BC has deeper ports and you can get bigger oil tankers in, the biggest, whereas BC, you're getting a medium-sized oil tanker. So they either load off onto a bigger oil tanker in the middle of the ocean, or it's smaller tankers that go to California. So it's, from a producer's side and from a consumer side, the Northwest BC ports are much more favorable also.
Okay, so that's the going west pipeline. What about going east? I've heard comments of late saying, no, we've already got pipelines going to Ontario and Quebec, and the Atlantic Canadian market is small, already served, sometimes by Canadian energy that goes to the United States and comes back up to Atlantic Canada, and that, as we talked about, Europe is not the growth market in the future. So do we need another pipeline coming east or not?
I haven't heard anyone excited about that in Calgary, since it was canceled. That's not the one that's on anyone's wish list. I don't think that Alberta would use, its purchasing power, to get Energy East done again. But they only, but the last 6 weeks raises a reason maybe to do Energy East, is that Ontario and Quebec are dependent on the United States, and the United States is looking like a fair weather friend. So there may be a national security reason, but we'll see what Trump does. I think it's premature to say let's build a pipeline so we're not dependent on the United States at all. We spent a century becoming energy interdependent with the United States. So that would be the case, but there isn't private sector interest in that for sure.
Critical minerals are also an issue. What do you think we should be doing there? Anything different than we've done in the past?
I mean, there's lots of things we should do different. We should do everything different. I always use a statistic to wake people up to what has happened. A couple statistics. And I've written about this, so I can send the sources for these and put in your links or whatever. But one is that it's the Impact Assessment Act is the number one thing I would do is reform that. And people often thought of when we called Bill C-69 the No More Pipelines bill and protested in Alberta. But the Impact Assessment Act affected all projects, mining, electricity, ports, refineries. So it wasn't just a pipeline thing. And in fact, if you look at major projects inventory from Natural Resources Canada, the amount of projects that were in the inventory in 2015, the amount that are in today, mining has had a harder hit than oil and gas. It has seen, I think an over 55%, if I remember my paper correctly, 55% drop in the number of projects in the inventory, things that were going to get built.
Hold it, say that again. Mining has had a harder hit than oil and gas because of
Yeah.
impact assessments?
Well, a lot of it is the Impact Assessment Act. Now, I have to say, a lot of it is commodity prices that the mining sector globally has had a lot of
So
problems.
it's not just government.
It's not just government, but the one thing we can control is government. We can't control global commodity prices. The other thing that we can't control is China. And China has deliberately manipulated quite a few different kind of commodities, especially battery metals, and has made, has dumped when they wanted to, has manipulated price, has invested many things they've done to manipulate those markets that have made it hard for, for actors purely working on the market, purely, trying to raise money, and TSX or where else, has made it very difficult for them to compete with Chinese product because they're selling it for so cheap. So there's a few things to do. You can't do anything about global commodity prices, but you can do something about the Impact Assessment Act. And the thing I would say the mining industry usually says, everyone says, is that we want one project, one assessment, one decision. Having both a provincial and a federal assessment, no one wants to do two assessments instead of one. And that's been the case. And so that's usually, the kind of the rallying cry. And then the second thing, again, to be a little more proactive vis-a-vis the Chinese threat, for me, would start to use defense spending to help critical minerals projects that we need for our defense supply chain. And if this seems radical, we're already doing this in partnership with the United States. The United States, through its Defense Production Act, has invested in 6 critical minerals projects in Canada in about the last 6 years. In lithium, cobalt, tungsten, maybe a handful of other things. And we've been matching them through Natural Resources Canada. And we all know that we need to increase our defense spending. So I don't know why we wouldn't use defense spending, count it, towards our 2% goal, and actually develop and process some of the more niche commodities that you need in a defense supply chain that China now has an absolute stranglehold, where they have 90% more of the global market. And that is a real risk. China's already put export restrictions, for example, on germanium and gallium and antimony. We can actually process germanium and gallium here in Canada. Teck can process germanium at its Trail, BC facility. Rio Tinto can process gallium in Quebec. They're already byproducts of things that they're already processing, they could ramp up. So to help them out, because there is no business case, again, because China is manipulating the market to sell it for cheaper than anyone else can compete with, purely on a market basis. And so to help that delta between how much they can sell gallium and germanium to NATO allies, to the West, and how much they can produce it for. So that is the one thing I would do on the security side with critical minerals.
So think about from a strategy standpoint or industrial policy standpoint. Some people are saying that we don't have free trade between provinces in Canada, and now might be the best opportunity to force that through in a consolidated strategy to combat Trump's tariff threats. Is now not potentially, if Danielle Smith was part of Team Canada and was negotiating with Canada for benefits, one of the best, if not the best time for her to get some of these things that we've been talking about in regards to pipelines, oil and gas support, critical mineral support, etc.?
Yeah, well, again, where I might defend Smith, and I think Alberta in particular has been the most open to reducing interprovincial trade barriers. And I think a lot of the problem has been in Ontario and Quebec, and so that the Western 4 provinces have negotiated the reduction of a few trade barriers. And if you didn't see, the National Bank put out, an assessment earlier this week to say that Canada's interprovincial trade barriers are equivalent to a 21% tariff. And so we could undo a lot of the harm that, a Trump tariff might do just by simply, facilitating it within our own borders. And this is something that, has been known for decades, that economists have an issue with, that there's been roundtables, people have made slow commitments, but Australia does it better, Europe does it better, United States does it better. We do it the worst. We have the most barriers. So
Why?
I don't know. I think maybe part of it is, some of when we talk about trade barriers is also, for example, labor mobility. That comes into it. So again, the way that you regulate nurses or the way that you regulate doctors, a lot of it is, safety things that, you can, again, just preventing people from being mobile, being able to take advantage of the best labor force, the most productive labor force. Some of it is liquor, where, all these stories come out where, you literally can't buy a bottle of wine in Montreal and bring it to Ontario or vice versa. Alberta and BC just negotiated a deal where we can buy BC wine now. Like, it's preposterous that we haven't been able to do that. But some of it, I think, is because, provinces have different tax regimes on these things. They're protected of their liquor taxes. Some of it is that the, professional regulatory bodies, have no interest in being more pan-national. So, but to your point, Brian, now this is a time, I think, where you'd have public support and to say, you know what, we don't care. We are done with all this bureaucracy. We are done with this complacency. You guys better figure it out, because we're in an economic crisis. We all know how our productivity has been trending. If some of this can be within our own power, that we can change these things, then you guys better
do it. And let's do it now.
Yes, I mean, I agree. This must be one of the most popular, voter, like, how many voters in Canada would say, no, keep all these barriers? I bet if you polled this, 80% of Canadians would be in favor of removing interprovincial trade barriers.
Heather Exner-Pirot for Prime Minister. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Heather in just 2 minutes. And we're going to talk a little bit about, Alberta and the place that it could play politically in Canada, because that's going to change fairly dramatically in the next couple of months. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Wire. We're chatting tonight with Heather Exner-Pirot. She's a person. What do you call yourself with the Macdonald-Laurier Commission? You're a director?
I'm a senior fellow, is probably, but I'm director of Energy, Natural Resources, and Environment.
Senior fellow and director of Natural Energy Resources and Development. You're a writer, you're a speaker, you're an analyst, you are an intellectual that knows what's going on from an energy standpoint in Canada, and from critical minerals, and also from an Indigenous relations, which I think is one of the big interests that you've got, is that a lot of these projects, we can partner up with our Indigenous groups and benefit people economically. The next Prime Minister, and maybe the next two Prime Ministers of Canada, are going to be from Alberta. Chrystia Freeland, Mark Carney are both born in Alberta, and Pierre Poilievre is from Alberta. And one of the first two will likely be the next Prime Minister of Canada. And then there's a good chance that Pierre Poilievre will be the following Prime Minister. And then along with Stephen Harper, who was Prime Minister for a great deal of time, that would mean that the Prime Ministership has been held by someone from Alberta for a long period of time. How does that change things, if at all?
Yeah, well, great question. And it is, it certainly is, a reflection of the tea leaves that the political center maybe has moved a little bit west, and certainly it has moved a little bit conservative. Just the fact that Carney, announced in Edmonton, as kind of some of his bona fides, he's a regular guy and he understands the West.
Hockey rink.
Yeah, and actually was born in Northwest Territories, which I also think is interesting. And Freeland also, again, saying, she's a proud Alberta girl this week in her X posting. Anyway, so it is interesting to see this shift. And maybe not surprising at all, where, oil and gas and energy and trade and LNG and what our allies are looking for is concentrated in the West. And oil and gas is the biggest of that. It is financially, power-wise too, but also uranium in Saskatchewan, natural gas in BC. When you look at where kind of our resource wealth is concentrated, a lot of it is out West. And so I guess it's not surprising. What does this mean? Again, I'm not a fan of pendulums going too far left or too far right. I guess I'm just a pragmatic centrist at the end of the day. And I have to say, from an industry investment perspective, big swings in policy are not attractive at all. And that's part of what motivates me, is to say, let's be consistent. And I also, we've talked about this before, Brian, when I've been on your show, that it's not healthy for society to go so far left to so far right. So while I think it's part of a worldwide trend, it is to become a bit more conservative, that there is some exasperation with wokeness. There's exasperation from a single-minded focus on climate change. I won't say it shouldn't be part of the conversation at all, but doing that at the exclusion of all other policies was obviously not popular. I would also be, I would also look ahead and say, come on, guys, let's not go too far right. Guilbeault, Trudeau, McKenna, they all went too far left and people rejected it. And if you go too far right, people will also reject that. And so here's an opportunity. I think, and Stephen Harper said this before, he wanted to move kind of the entire country to the right permanently, a little bit more of a, small c conservative aspect to Canada. But let's not push people away by going too far out of, what would normally be the Canadian center.
Do you think Pierre Poilievre is at risk of doing that?
Well, I do. Of course I do. I mean, Trump is at risk of doing that. Of course. And you certainly see how it happened. I have different thoughts on this. One is that he is certainly to the right of, a progressive conservative, kind of Canadian ethos. And people will say, oh, he'll never, he'll never get elected. He'll never, Quebec will never accept him. And they were wrong. He's overwhelmingly not a polarizing figure, overwhelmingly a popular choice to be the next prime minister. And so there's some of that, is to say that maybe Canada wasn't so precious. Maybe it wasn't so left wing. Maybe there was some appetite for this kind of just pro-growth, pro-economy kind of standpoint. And on the other hand, I have to say that you remember with Erin O'Toole last time, where they did win the popular vote, but they lost. And part of the reason they lost was because Maxime Bernier, outflanked him on the right and took a lot of the votes on the right. So there was in the Conservative Party the need to absorb that wing, that flank back into the Conservative so that you're not splitting the right. And the right is often split. And so there was something smart about, Poilievre really appealing to what would have been the People's Party kind of constituency and bringing the fold. Now, I guess the question is, when we get to an election period, will the Conservatives be able to pivot without offending their base or without alienating their base? Danielle Smith did so kind of just barely with the UCP in Alberta, also was seen as too far right, had to pivot into the center. That's always going to be the struggle for any right-wing party, I think, in this country, is to maintain your base and make your base happy, but also get a critical mass of voters.
So Doug Ford would appear to, he's talking about potentially massive billions of dollars of spending, industrial strategy kind of spending if the Trump tariffs go ahead. He would appear to be moving to the left, moving to the center, I guess. I mean,
I would say, if you were just, a political scientist looking at Doug Ford, not particularly conservative, but more populist. And, if that's a winning strategy, then good for you. But yeah, I wouldn't say that he's, philosophically, sticking to conservative principles. He sticks to things that he thinks are popular. I don't mean that with any derision. I think that's objectively true.
So let me ask you, if you were asked to go into Danielle Smith's office and or Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland's office and provide advice on what you think they should do, what would be your different advice for those two different meetings?
Well, it wouldn't be different advice for me. I guess that's the beauty of working for a think tank, is that, you kind of think, this is what the policy would dictate. This would be the right thing. Now, I have to say, Chrystia Freeland, maybe some of your listeners saw her op-ed in the Toronto Star, even though it was paywalled behind the Toronto Star. So, not that many Canadians saw it, but I saw it. And a list of things she said she wanted to do was secure the border, protect Arctic security, enhance critical minerals exploitation and processing, whatever production, and build out LNG facilities. Brian, this is my list. I mean, she could be a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute now. And as Erin O'Toole pointed out, that was also his list, a couple of years back. And part of me is just such a pragmatist at heart. I love to see Freeland. I love David Eby, also the BC NDP premier this week, wrote an op-ed saying that they need to reduce regulation, that they need to enhance, build energy infrastructure. I love to hear it. I'm glad that the Canadian Centre is now pro-LNG, pro-Arctic security, pro-critical minerals, and pro-reducing regulation. And so, Poilievre's been saying that, which is why, I'm not a partisan, but support their platform very much. In general, support Danielle Smith and her platform, even though I might take some issues with the tactics this week. And it's music to my ears to see Carney say he wants to be pro-growth and Freeland say she wants to do her list. So I love to see it. I want to maintain that center. Let's do it. Let's use this critical mass that we have.
So if everyone agrees that this is the right strategy, why haven't we done it in the past? Has it been just this over focus on climate change?
I think so. I mean, I'll sound like the crazy right-winger Albertan, but it is certainly the case that the media was more to the left than the Canadian, population or the American population or the German population or what have you. Certainly the case that the university and academics and so-called experts were more to the left than the average, Joe. And that those voices do dominate the media sphere, dominates the bureaucracy, who are almost, exclusively white collar, university educated urban workers. That's where they live and work. And so that, institutionally, these ideas were embedded, and maybe, and it becomes a shock for someone like Trump to win, or someone like Poilievre to be polling as he is, 20, 25% above the Liberals. And I have to say this, it wasn't until Trump was doing better in the polls, it wasn't until Poilievre was doing better in the polls that you did see media and academia and bureaucrats start to come to the right, not wanting to be, I think, so out of sync with the vast majority of Canadians, not wanting to be that elitist in the bubble outside with unpopular ideas. And so in this case, it wasn't the elite that led the new ideas. It was the, average Joe that pulled them back to the center.
Really? So this is interesting. So we got to be listening to the average Joe a lot more than we have been.
Well, that's what democracy is for, I guess, is, at the end of the day, you can, what you hear, and I always say this, and I believe this to my heart, Twitter is not a real place. It is not a real reflection of how people think. Most people don't like partisanship. And maybe, Brian, you live a different life, but I'll tell you, out here in rural Alberta, never talk about what I tweeted about, never talk about op-eds, barely even talk about politics at all, either Danielle Smith or Trudeau. Most people don't want to talk about it. And so, Twitter's not real life. The media is not real life. And that's why you have an election every couple of years, is to be like, what do the people actually want? And almost always what the people want is a better economy.
Better economy. And the key to success in that better economy, as far as you're concerned, is number one, support for growth of the oil and gas energy sector. Number two, critical minerals. And the way that we get both of those is what? Get rid of the regulation, or at least ease the regulatory stranglehold on investment. And you've come up with some great suggestions on how government can help that through really being a backstop to the capacity commitments that pipeline developers need, so that they've got some assurance of revenue over time, so that they can manage their way through the economic situation. I guess politically, just more support, so that it doesn't look like it's going to be railroaded out of possibility by environmental regulation or Indigenous opposition or other things in the future. I think that we haven't talked about this. I'd love to hear your point of view on it again, but partnering with Indigenous communities such that they are there and supportive. Critical minerals as well as oil and gas. And then get rid of tariff barriers between the provinces. And then having a Team Canada approach, tit for tat, with the Trump potential tariff threat, and not giving up our golden egg that you think is the oil and gas business in those negotiations. So not appearing weak. Would that be sort of your strategy?
This sounds like a fantastic campaign platform. We should write it down and send it to everybody. And I have to say this, Canada is not a good spot, and I don't think our leaders covered themselves in glory in this last week or in these last few months. But I am still very optimistic because, and I always say this, there's 200 countries in the world that wish they had the problems that Canada had. We still have an abundance of energy. We have abundance of materials, as lumber, minerals, everything. We have an abundance of food. We export all these things. We have so much that we don't need it all for themselves, and we export it. 41 million people in the second biggest country in the world. And so while, this short term will be probably unsettling, and there's a lot of unpredictability, in the medium term, if it shakes us out of our complacency and we start using the amazing tools, the amazing endowment that we've been given, we can all be a winner. And that's why I do love economic development, is because it's not a zero-sum game. We can all be better off. There doesn't have to be losers, when you're just growing the economy. Everyone can benefit from that.
So if we've got all these benefits, if we're in a situation where 200 other countries envy us, why are we all so negative about Canada?
Well, I don't think we're particularly well governed right now, is certainly part of it. And yeah, I always think about this, Brian, like if you were given, some of the world's largest oil reserves, gas reserves, uranium reserves, minerals reserves, arable land, I actually wrote an article for this on the Wilson Center saying basically this: imagine you were made the Prime Minister of Canada, one of the richest countries in the world, endowed with natural resources, and you decided what you were going to do is stymie the development of those resources. I've said, if I was Canada's energy and mineral minister, I'd be the most popular woman in the world. I would have friends with every single world leader. I'd be making deals. Canada would be rich. I just can't believe getting in that position and saying, and this is what he said: I want you to know us for resourcefulness, not for resources. And what do I chalk this up to? Is being from Saskatchewan and living now in rural Alberta is an embarrassment amongst the Laurentian elite for being hewers of water, haulers of wood, for being the country cousin when they go to Europe, when they go to DC, and wanting to be known for something different, being embarrassed, that Canada is just, a 20th century economy, 19th century economy. And for me, I think it's so disrespectful that if they went to see a mine, if they went to see what our farmers do in 2025, if they went to see what the oil sands, how they made that deposit economic, if they want to see what it takes to build a TMX pipeline. This is engineering genius. This is competing at a global scale in the most competitive, longest running, markets in the world. And to think that this is, these are a bunch of dummies with trucks that do this and that it's easy and that we should be doing something, more ambitious, more worthy, that's been insulting to me.
Heather Exner-Pirot, thank you so much. I think that you are a incredible analyst and advocate for the oil and gas business, for the energy business, for Western Canada and for Canada. And I wish some of our political leaders would listen to you a lot more than they are today. You're fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Brian. Always my pleasure. And thanks for exposing, some Albertans to your Ontario audience.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from Alberta at www.saga960am.ca and or get all my podcasts and videos on my website, briancrombie.com. I have had the privilege of going up to Fort McMurray and seeing the oil sands development, and it is unbelievable. I've also been in a couple different mines in Alberta and British Columbia. And I think Heather's got a point. I think too few of us from Toronto, from Ontario, end up visiting Alberta, British Columbia, seeing some of those natural resource assets that we have, and how technologically advanced they are. And, I think I've talked to you about this before, Heather. When I was doing a due diligence trip through Calgary, Edmonton, and Fort McMurray and asking a lot of oil and gas business executives, I didn't find any that were climate change deniers. I didn't. No, they wanted to make sure that, as you said, we invested in our oil and gas business and developed it. But they weren't deniers. They were looking at things like carbon capture. They were looking at ways of reducing our carbon input, carbon impact. They were very smart, capable, well-thinking individuals that were looking for the best for Canada and the best for Western Canada. They weren't climate change deniers. At least I didn't find them. Maybe
No, I
didn't invite them
agree.
to my meetings.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, tens of billions of dollars have been spent by Canada's oil and gas industry to make solutions that are scalable in the world. And the dilemma we have is trying to have cheap, affordable, accessible energy while also reducing carbon impact. And I have to say, you know, it's not bureaucrats that are going to figure that out. It's the chemists and the engineers and the people who know how to finance energy projects, who are doing the work of figuring that out. People don't know this. The emissions, the absolute emissions out of the oil and gas sector in Canada peaked in 2015, even as production has grown by 1 million barrels. And so they have come up with some pretty good solutions, much more than almost any other country. And I will always say this, the best climate solution is to export more Canadian commodities, because in almost any commodity, we will be a better performer, environmentally, not least, obviously ethically, you know, but including environmentally. You know, people hate on coal. Our metallurgical coal is the lowest GHG intense in the world. You know, our farmland. Anyways, in every case, I think we're better off if there's more Canadian product out in the world.
The world needs more Canada. That's our show for tonight. Good night, everybody.